was only 2 years and 8 months old. Too young to understand the weight of silence, but not too young to feel it. The moment the whispers stopped when she entered a room, the strange way people bowed, but avoided her eyes. The fact that no one called her princess anymore. Only Lady Elizabeth, as if her name alone had been sentenced to exile. No one dared to tell the child the truth. But something in her small chest began to ache without reason. Because somewhere in the stone belly of the Tower of London, on a morning that began with a prayer and ended with a sword, her mother had been killed, not in battle, not by illness, not in an accident, but by the man who was supposed to protect them both, her father, the King of England, on the 19th of May, year 1536. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, was led to a scaffold constructed near the White Tower, dressed not in rags of guilt, but in grace, walking upright, as if attending her own coronation rather than her execution. The air was thick with fear, disguised as formality. There was no axe, no wooden block, only black velvet spread over hay, and a French executioner imported from Calais for his supposed mercy. A single clean stroke, instead of the botched, clumsy horror an English headsman might deliver. The crowd, packed with courtiers, foreign observers, and servants who once bowed to her, watched with breaths half-held and eyes already wet. She forgave them all. She forgave her accusers, her husband, even those who came to watch her die. She knelt on the velvet, whispered her soul into the wind. "O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." And in a breath, a trick of distraction was played. She looked one way. The sword came from the other. And in a flash so clean it seemed unreal, the head of a queen rolled gently into a basket. The executioner removed his shoes before killing her, as if death were sacred and deserved quiet. The woman who had been crowned with garlands and golden promise just 3 years earlier was now being buried in an arrow chest, hastily, with no ceremony, no music, and no royal mourning. But it wasn't just Anne who died that day. A daughter lost a mother, a country lost a queen, and a crown lost its conscience. Little Elizabeth, banished to the sidelines of power, was suddenly stripped of everything. She was no longer the heir but a complication, a reminder, a wound. Her title vanished. Her name was demoted. Even her clothes became a problem. Letters were sent to Thomas Cromwell, pleading that she had no new gowns, no proper shifts, no petticoats that fit. Lady Bryan, who cared for her, wrote in desperation that the child had outgrown everything, and still no garments were sent. The court pretended she did not exist, but the silence around her screamed louder than any trumpet of war. Her household was ordered to reduce expenses. She was to stay in her chambers, unseen and unheard. Even her father, the king, refused to look at her for long. Every glance reminded him of Anne's eyes, Anne's mouth, Anne's blood. And it was blood he had spilled. No one told Elizabeth what had happened to her mother, but she felt it in the shifting shadows. She remembered hands that once held her, voices that once laughed above her cradle. Then, suddenly, there was only absence. Once, she asked aloud, "How hath it yesterday, my lady princess? And today, but my lady Elizabeth?" And no one answered. How could they? How could anyone explain to a child that her mother had been murdered by royal decree, that her name had been erased from prayers, and her memory silenced by command? She was too young to comprehend, but not too young to carry it. Henry VIII did not mourn Anne publicly. There were no state rituals. In fact, he married Jane Seymour only 11 days after Anne's death. While the world moved on, Elizabeth stayed behind, locked inside a world where love was conditional and legitimacy was fragile. Her existence became an afterthought, managed by caretakers and guarded by suspicion. Even her caretakers were terrified to misstep what gift might be interpreted as treason, what display of affection might be seen as rebellion. And yet, this was not the end of her story. It was only the blood-soaked prologue. The child who once needed to borrow sleeves and shoes, whose very name was a reminder of a beheaded queen, would one day wear a crown heavier than all the shame ever thrown upon her. She would learn how to speak so that no one dared interrupt her. She would study, in silence, the art of being underestimated. She would grow into a woman who never forgot what power could take, but also what it could give. When she ascended the throne, she did not do so to avenge her mother's death, or to punish those who had forgotten her. She did so because the throne had nowhere else to go. It had burned through every other heir, betrayed every other queen, and killed every other marriage, and still it sat empty, waiting for the girl whose life began in disgrace, whose blood was denied, but whose destiny refused to yield. Anne Boleyn died, with her eyes open, looking not at her executioner, but at the sky beyond him. And perhaps it was in that moment, when her lips moved in silent prayer and her body knelt in final dignity, that a different kind of queen was born. Not the one who knelt that day, but the one who would rise decades later with a voice that no sword could silence. Elizabeth never spoke often of her mother. Perhaps she learned early that memory was dangerous in a court where truth could be punished, but in the way she ruled with caution, with brilliance, with a refusal to surrender to the whims of any man. It is easy to imagine Anne's ghost watching quietly from a high window, whispering through time, "You lived for both of us." It was still early when they let her out. The stone courtyard had not yet warmed under the pale sun of May, and though the birds stirred in the trees around the Tower of London, they did not sing that morning, as if the sky itself knew what was about to unfold. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, once crowned with golden arches and cheered by a crowd that had believed she would bring change, now walked toward her own death with steps so measured and calm that the soldiers beside her dared not speak. She wore a gown of grey damask and a mantle of ermine, and on her head, beneath the coif, her dark eyes looked forward without blinking. She was not dragged. She did not stumble. She did not cry. She walked as if she had already left the world, and all that remained was to bow to ritual. The scaffold was not high, but it was wide enough for those watching to see everything. It had been built with care, not for respect, but for efficiency, placed near the White Tower so that the deed could be done without delay and without distraction. The straw was fresh, laid thick across the boards, and a square of black velvet marked the place where she was to kneel. There would be no block for her neck. This was no common execution. A French swordsman had been brought from Calais at the king's command, a man who had studied the art of beheading with a blade so sharp that death came before the body knew it had been touched. It was said that Henry VIII had done this out of mercy, out of love perhaps, or guilt, but those who watched knew better. A clean cut was not a kindness. It was a performance. It was a way to erase her quickly, without the mess, without the echo of screams, without the need to look at her eyes too long. Anne turned to the crowd. Her voice faint at first, but it grew as if carried by something more than breath, perhaps faith, or the desperate need to leave behind something unbroken. She did not protest her innocence. She did not accuse her enemies. Instead, she prayed for the king, called him merciful, begged the people to think kindly of her, and asked them to pray not for justice, but for her soul. Her ladies wept openly, but Anne did not. She removed her mantle. She untied her coif. She handed her small belongings to those around her without trembling. Then she knelt. Her eyes were blindfolded by gentle hands. And in the final seconds, she whispered to the air, "To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. Lord, receive my spirit." The executioner removed his shoes, so his steps would be soundless. And then, with practiced grace, he called out to a boy behind her, drawing her attention away. While her head turned slightly, the sword swung from the opposite side, and in a single, perfect stroke, severed her head from her body. There was no scream, no second attempt, just a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow the world. The head of the queen fell into straw, her eyes still closed beneath the blindfold, her lips still parted as if in prayer. Her body slumped gently forward, crumpling like silk dropped on stone. The witnesses stood frozen. Some wept. Some looked away. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated her downfall, watched in a silence more terrible than any confession. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, later said she who had been queen on earth would now become queen in heaven, but the king did not come to see her die. He was already planning his next marriage. Her body was taken away in an arrow chest, too short for dignity, too plain for a queen, and buried without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls. There was no royal mourning, no procession, no black drapery on the palace gates. The name of Anne Boleyn was struck from records, her badges torn down, her initials removed from tapestries and walls. She became a ghost, not just in death, but in history. And yet, in a quiet room far from the tower, a little girl woke to a world that had changed without her knowing. Elizabeth, just over 2 years old, stirred in her bed and found that her nursemaids were quieter than usual, their hands busier, their words more careful. She was still dressed each day. It still fed and walked and sung to. But the mood had shifted, and though no one told her why, she could feel it in the hush between footsteps and the way her name sounded when spoken. No longer Princess Elizabeth, but simply Lady Elizabeth, as if something had been taken from her that she had not yet learned to value. Her governess, Lady Bryan, tried to keep the routines intact. She brushed Elizabeth's hair gently, told her stories at night, watched her grow taller each week, and outgrow her clothes. But the royal wardrobe had stopped sending garments. The child had no new gowns, no fresh smocks or cloaks. Lady Bryan wrote to Thomas Cromwell, with trembling hand, begging for supplies, not luxury, just necessities. She wrote of the child's needs: no gran, no kerchiefs, no sleeves or rails, not even a single petticoat. Her words were not political. They were maternal, a woman begging for dignity on behalf of a daughter who had been forgotten by her own blood. Elizabeth noticed, not with logic, but with instinct. She asked once, aloud, "How hath it yesterday, my lady princess? And today but my lady Elizabeth?" And no one could answer. The adults looked away. The silence was unbearable. She began to understand, not the words, but the weight behind them, the absence, the loss, the wrongness that no lullaby could soothe. Her father did not visit. He did not write. He sent no gifts. Henry VIII, who had once held her in his arms and called her his pearl, could no longer bear to look at her without seeing the face of Anne. He punished her with distance, with quiet, with neglect. Her position was uncertain, her future undefined. Even the servants were unsure how to address her. And yet, she was watched. She was studied. She was still a tutor. As weeks passed, her world shrank, no longer allowed to appear at court. Elizabeth remained in the care of Lady Bryan and Lady Shelton. The walls around her grew taller. The silence stretched longer. But within her, something else began to grow. A stillness that was not surrender. A strength that was not loud. She watched the way people lied with smiles. She learned how names could vanish overnight. She understood that crowns did not protect, that they demanded silence, obedience, and sacrifice. And she would never forget. They never told her exactly what had happened on that scaffold. Not in words. But she would find out. In fragments. In glances. In records half burned. In the silence that always thickened when someone spoke of her mother. In the way people avoided the name Anne Boleyn, even when they praised Elizabeth to her face. And when she was old enough to read, she would read everything. She would learn that her mother had died for a lie, that justice had been nothing more than theater, that queens could be unmade with ink and steel. And from all of that, from the blood, the shame, the loss, she would begin to build something else. Not vengeance, not rebellion, but an understanding of what power really meant, of how it could be used, how it could destroy, and how it could protect. The silence that raised her was not empty. It was full of lessons. There is a kind of silence that follows a beheading, not the silence of peace or mourning, but the silence of erasure. The way a name is scrubbed from a stone, the way a title is revoked, not with noise, but with absence. And that was the silence that wrapped itself around Elizabeth in the days and weeks after her mother knelt on the scaffold and surrendered both her body and her crown to the sword. What was once princess became lady. And no one explained the change to the child whose cradle had once been gilded with prophecy, whose birth had once been celebrated with trumpets, even as disappointment stirred in the heart of her father. Elizabeth Tudor had not been born a boy. And for that, the world had already begun to punish her. But when Anne Boleyn lost her head beneath the grey sky of the Tower, it was not only her life that ended, but the protection Elizabeth's status had once afforded her. At barely 3 years of age, Elizabeth could not grasp the magnitude of what had been taken. But she understood change in the way all children do, in the timbre of voices that no longer laughed as they once had. In the new weight of her name, when spoken without affection, in the sudden distance of those who once called her, Your Highness, and now barely bowed. In the tightness of Lady Bryan's hands when they brushed her hair each night before bed, and in the way the morning light seemed colder when it spilled through the nursery windows and no longer carried with it the scent of rose oil her mother once wore. Lady Bryan, who had served in royal nurseries longer than some had lived, tried to protect the child from the court's sharp turn of favor. But even her steady hands could not hide the letters piling up unanswered, the coin purse that never arrived, the sudden and complete withdrawal of royal support. One evening, with Elizabeth's dress let out as far as it could go, and still too tight across her shoulders, Lady Bryan sat by candlelight and wrote to Thomas Cromwell. Her words neither grand nor flattering, but heavy with quiet desperation. She explained that the child was growing, that she had no petticoats, no manteles, no kerchiefs, not even sleeves or linen enough to keep her warm. And she begged not for luxuries but for dignity, for cloth to shield a forgotten child from a world already turning away. There was no reply. Elsewhere, her cousin Mary, once declared illegitimate herself after Henry VIII had set aside Catherine of Aragon, watched the changes in Elizabeth's household with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. For she, too, I knew what it was to be cast aside by the very blood that had given her breath. When Lady Bryan was commanded to treat Mary as lesser, she obeyed only in word, never in heart. And when the same order came for Elizabeth, she held her ground. This child, she once whispered to the nursemaid when they thought no one was listening, I will need every ounce of strength we give her now, for the world will give her none later. In the great halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court, her name was no longer spoken with celebration. Henry VIII, who once cradled her in the crook of his arm and called her my little pearl, now flinched when courtiers brought her up. His voice cold, his eyes distant. Some said it was guilt. Others believed it was simply fear that in Elizabeth's small face, he saw too much of Anne, too much of the woman he could not forget, even as he tried to erase her. The king had ordered her execution, but he could not extinguish the echo of her eyes, nor the uncanny way Elizabeth's brows arched just like hers, the way she turned her head when thinking, or how her mouth shaped a stubborn silence when she refused to speak. They kept Elizabeth away from court, and locked her world into narrower circles, instructed that she should be seen less, and heard not at all. She was no longer a pawn in marriage games, no longer a prize of diplomacy. Not while her name reminded foreign ambassadors of scandal and Englishmen of the sharp edge of treason, but in the absence of public attention, something quiet and strange began to form in her. Like a candle lit in the belly of a cave, small, flickering, but persistent. She listened more than she spoke. She observed the way people bowed with shallow reverence, the way titles could be stripped overnight, how power could change hands with a whisper, how the same lips that once kissed her mother's hand now refused to say her name. She learned quickly that affection in court was currency, but truth was a liability. When Cromwell came to visit her household, not to offer aid, but to set expectations, he brought with him not warmth, but warning. The child was not to expect more than what was given. The king had no immediate plans for her. Her future was uncertain. Her position was fragile. But Elizabeth, even at that age, I seemed not to weep. She stood beside Lady Bryan as the minister spoke, and stared at him with a gaze so still, so penetrating, that the man looked away before his sentence was finished. In private, she began to ask questions. Not about her mother. Not directly. She asked why her name was no longer read in chapel prayers. She asked why the other children at court had godparents and portraits, and she did not. She asked why her clothes were mended so often, and why her nursemaids sometimes cried when they thought she was asleep. One day, she asked, "Is it worse to have had a queen for a mother, or none at all?" No one answered. And yet, she understood. She understood it not as an adult understands justice or politics or betrayal, but as a child understands grief, that hollow where presence once lived, that throb beneath the ribs where safety used to be. And so she built her own kind of safety, not with walls, but with knowledge. She began to read early, devouring books and pages and scrolls, not just for curiosity, but for armor. She memorized names, traced the lineage of kings, studied languages and law, because she knew the crown would not come looking for her. And if she ever touched it, it would be because she had walked toward it with her own hands, not because it had been placed gently on her brow. The woman who knelt for a kingdom had left behind a child who was learning not to kneel for anything. When others slept, Elizabeth studied. When others gossiped, she listened, and while the court tried to forget her, she remembered everything. Every look, every silence, every name erased. And deep within her, where the pain of abandonment had once pressed like cold stone against her ribs, something else had begun to grow, a voice. Still small, still forming, but destined to rise. Not to scream, not to beg, but to command. The wind that rattled the windows of Elizabeth's chambers in the spring of year 1537 was not the same wind that once carried her mother's laughter through the long stone halls of Greenwich. For now the air pressed differently against the glass, as if bearing the weight of a world that had decided to look away from the child who had once been its promised light. And though the sun still rose and the palace servants still performed their duties with mechanical grace, there was something hollow in the routine. Something missing not only in name, but in nourishment. For Elizabeth was growing, and the court had stopped, pretending it noticed. Lady Bryan, who had served queens and carried infants through plague and rebellion, knew when a child's needs were being ignored, not by accident but by design. And so she took up her quill with hands more familiar with lullabies than politics, and wrote her heart into words meant for Thomas Cromwell, the man whose seal now dictated the flow of coin and favor from the king's heart to the lives he left behind. And in that letter, she did not flatter, did not scheme. I did not try to play the court's dangerous games. She simply told the truth. She wrote of petticoats, turned gray with wear, of shifts, too short for limbs that had grown without permission, of sleeves, torn and stitched and torn again, of cloaks that no longer held warmth, of a child who had nothing new to wear, not even a single fresh kerchief to tie around her neck when the air grew cold. And she asked, not for jewels or brocade or luxury, but for dignity, the dignity of a child not left naked by politics, not punished for her mother's death, not forgotten in a nursery that once received silk from Venice and linen from France. And still, no answer came. Each day, Lady Bryan checked the door, the stairwell, the corridor outside the chambers, waiting for a knock, a scroll, a messenger's step. But all she heard was the quiet creak of disinterest, the distant laughter of a court that had already moved on to Jane Seymour and her swelling belly, to hopes of a son that might finally erase the ghost of Anne Boleyn from the palace walls. But ghosts are not so easily banished. And Elizabeth was no longer just a child. She was the living shadow of the woman they had tried to bury with silence. Lady Bryan wrote again. This time her words more urgent, less measured, like a mother rather than a servant. She begged for direction, for instruction, for money. But more than that, she begged for clarity, because she no longer knew how to address the child, how to dress her, how to guide the other women who served her. Was she still to be treated as a princess? Or had she been officially stripped of all rank? No edict had come. No official word had been spoken. Only the quiet suffocation of unanswered questions. Sir John Shelton, Elizabeth's uncle by blood, wrote too, pleading for funds to maintain the small and shrinking household, informing Cromwell that without coin or command, they could not continue, not with meat, not with candles, not with firewood, not with any of the things that a child needed, not just to be comfortable, but to survive. And yet the response from court was cold, delayed, distant, and always insufficient. Elizabeth, now older by months that passed slowly but left their mark, it began to notice more than just the change in clothes. She noticed how visitors looked at her, with uncertain eyes. How even well-meaning servants hesitated before addressing her. How the other children at court avoided speaking of her mother. And how no one ever mentioned the word queen in her presence anymore. She knew enough not to ask too loudly. She learned that asking led to silence. And silence was the sharpest answer of all. One morning, she asked Lady Brian, "If I have no title, and no mother, and no father who comes, what am I?" And Lady Brian, steady and strong in the face of fire and famine, had no answer to give. Only a quiet embrace, and the promise that she would always be something more than what the court decided. In those days, Elizabeth began to keep her observations to herself. And where once she had been open and bright and curious, she now became quiet, watchful, precise. She listened when others thought she did not. She memorized every phrase in every book she was given, as if learning might offer the security that a surname no longer could. And still, her clothes wore thinner, her shoes cracked, her bodices needed patching, the hems were let down again and again. And one day, as Lady Shelton measured her against a gown that once belonged to a cousin, Elizabeth looked her in the eye and said, "You may lengthen the skirts, but you cannot shorten the shame." That day, Lady Shelton cried for hours alone in her chambers. At court, they spoke of Elizabeth as an inconvenience, a child to be managed but not considered. And though Henry VIII still called her his daughter in name, he refused to see her, refused to allow her presence near the court. Perhaps not out of hatred, but out of guilt, for she carried her mother's face like a mirror he could not bear to look into. Others made suggestions that she be brought to court to greet foreign guests, to show strength and unity, but the king always declined, muttering that it would bring up the past, that it would confuse matters. And so the girl remained behind, not quite banished, but not quite remembered either. And yet, something unshakable was being forged in that quiet. A resilience born not of privilege but of abandonment. For Elizabeth was learning to survive, not with favors, but without them, not with titles, but with thought, not with affection, but with the armor of intellect. The court may have withdrawn its gifts, but it had also withdrawn its manipulation. And in the space where others were shaped by attention, Elizabeth was being shaped by solitude. There was a stillness in her, but not emptiness. There was silence, but not surrender. She began to see the world not as a child of court should see it, but as one who understood that everything could be taken without warning clothes, names, love, position, and therefore, anything she built for herself would have to be built from within. The petticoat never came. The gowns never arrived. The letters were never answered. But Elizabeth did not vanish. She grew, quietly, sharply, deliberately. And one day, when she stood tall enough to reach for the doorknob herself, she opened it not just to the corridor beyond her chamber, but to a future. The court had never intended her to have a future. No one had dressed her for a future no one had expected. A future that would one day bear her name. And not the name of the man who had left her behind. There are fathers who lift their children onto their shoulders so they can see further. And there are fathers who cannot bear to see the eyes of their daughters because those eyes hold too much of what they destroyed. And Henry VIII was the latter. For no matter how loud the court's music played, how thick the meat on his table, or how golden the tapestries on his walls, the sight of Elizabeth his child, by the woman whose head he had ordered removed, was something he could neither explain nor endure. And so he chose not to see her at all. in the corridors of Whitehall, in the candlelit corners of Hampton Court. Her name was spoken less and less, not with hatred, but with discomfort, of the way a room falls quiet when someone enters with news no one wants to hear. And though she was still a Tudor, still carried royal blood, her presence stirred something in the king that made courtiers avoid the subject altogether. As if acknowledging her would reopen a wound the kingdom had agreed to keep closed. When Henry passed through the chapel and saw a young girl with flame-red hair kneeling in prayer, he turned the other way. When her tutors sent reports of her reading, her manners, her progress, he skimmed the parchment and gave no answer. When gifts were suggested, books, a new gown, and a trinket of favor, he refused with a sharp wave of his hand, saying it was not the time. But what he could not erase was how much she resembled her mother. Anne's spirit, sharp and questioning, lived behind Elizabeth's calm eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, had that same careful cadence, measured, deliberate, a quiet mirror of the woman whose rise had changed a nation and whose fall had made history bleed. When Jane Seymour bore Henry a son in year 1537, the king rejoiced as though the sky itself had opened in mercy, and he named the boy Edward and called him his heir, the prince who would continue the Tudor name without shame, without shadow, without memory. And yet, Elizabeth was still there, still breathing, still learning, and still growing. And no matter how tightly the king clutched his new joy, the existence of his daughter remained an echo of the marriage he had undone and the queen he had executed. It was said that once, when asked if Elizabeth would be brought to court to meet foreign guests, the king's jaw tightened, and he replied, "Not while the stain of her mother's sin remains." But what sin, truly, had Elizabeth ever known? She had not chosen her birth. She had not written her mother's sentence. She had not built the scaffold. She had only arrived into a world already broken and tried to walk through it with steady feet. Those who served Elizabeth learned to move in shadows. Her governesses avoided using the word queen in her presence. The royal tailor no longer took her measurements. Her name appeared on no invitation scrolls. She was, by decree not of law, but of shame, invisible. And yet, the king loved her, or so they said. They said he smiled when he heard she was clever. They said he laughed when told she had memorized a psalm before her brother had learned to speak. They said he once kissed her forehead when no one else was watching. But whether it was a kiss of love or guilt, no one could be sure. What was certain is that he did not look her in the eyes. He could not, because her eyes held a memory that no sword could sever. Elizabeth, young, though she was, understood what absence meant. She learned that love could be measured not in words, but in distance. She learned that even a king could be afraid of what he had created. And while other children sought their parents' approval in laughter and games, she sought it in silence, in perfection, in posture, in never giving anyone reason to doubt her worth. She read every book that entered her chamber. She practiced her letters until her fingers cramped. She sat straighter than any noble child, never once needing to be corrected. And when she was alone, she whispered questions into the air. Questions no one dared answer. Did he hold me when I was born? Did he cry when he signed her death? Would he love me? If I had been a boy, the court, for its part, adjusted quickly, where once they praised her complexion, her wit, her grace. They now spoke of her with cautious reserve, always watching the king's face for cues, always careful never to show too much kindness, for kindness could be misread as disloyalty. And disloyalty in Henry's England was a blade waiting to fall. Ambassadors wrote of her as the bastard daughter, but admitted, with reluctant awe, that she had a presence beyond her years. One called her a girl made of silence and steel. Another said, "She speaks rarely, but when she does, the room holds its breath." Henry may not have looked at her, but the world did, and the world remembered. She was not invited to Edward's christening. She was not granted lands. She was not given her mother's jewels, but she was not forgotten, because Elizabeth had begun to shape herself, not in the image of her mother, nor the approval of her father, but in the emptiness left between the two, and that space, that void, became her strength. She learned to look people in the eye, even when they looked away. She learned to carry herself with the weight of a title she no longer held. She learned to wait not passively, but patiently for the day when the eyes that had refused to see her would one day be forced to watch her rise. The king grew older. The court shifted. Another wife. Then another. But Elizabeth remained quiet. Steady. Impossible to dismiss. And in the stillness between glances, between letters not sent, between gifts not given and visits never made, the girl grew into something the king would never understand and the court would never expect. Not a shadow, not a scandal, but a storm gathering beneath the silk of a forgotten gown, long before she became a queen, before the crown weighed against her brow and the scepter balanced in her hand. Elizabeth Tudor was a child who learned to search for her mother in the faces of other women. For in the long corridors of Ashridge and Hatfield, where the tapestries muffled grief and the candles burned too low to chase away the cold, there were no lullabies sung in the voice of Anne Boleyn, no perfume of rosewater on a mother's wrist, no bedtime blessing whispered from the woman who had risked everything to bring her into the world and had paid for it with her life. In place of Anne stood others, women appointed, not by blood or love, but by duty and court politics, yet even they, in their flawed and fractured ways, stitched themselves into the quiet spaces of the girl's heart, not as replacements, but as shadows who helped her stand while the rest of the world wished she would disappear. Lady Margaret Bryan was the first to hold Elizabeth after Anne's death, the first to kiss her cheek without trembling, though her hands carried the tremor of what she knew too well, that children born to queens who fall do not always grow old. She had raised Mary before her, had watched the rise and ruin of queens, and in Elizabeth's eyes, she saw not innocence, but the echo of a court that devoured its daughters. Still, she dressed the girl each morning, smoothed her hair, taught her the names of saints and stars, and when no one else dared say the word mother, she whispered it once while placing a ribbon in Elizabeth's hand, a ribbon too fine for a forgotten child, a ribbon that might once have belonged to Anne herself. Then there was Lady Shelton, kin to the Boleyn line, who brought with her the smell of parchment and lavender, whose voice never softened into lullaby, but remained brisk and ironed with duty. She did not love easily, but she protected fiercely. And when the king's messengers came with instructions that Elizabeth be kept from the public eye, treated not as princess, but as ward, Lady Shelton stood in the doorway with a straight back and made no apology for the child eating at her table, nor for the books piling on her windowsill, nor for the harp Elizabeth plucked with aching fingers on gray afternoons when no one came. In the dark, when storms broke across the palace rooftops, Lady Shelton would place a candle by the girl's bed and say nothing at all, because she knew silence was sometimes safer than comfort. There were others, wet nurses, maids, tutors' wives, whose names blurred into corners of memory, but whose kindness left fingerprints on the soul of a child, learning to survive in a world that never asked if she was afraid. They brought her figs when she coughed, stitched her sleeves when the court would not send cloth, told her stories that skirted dangerously close to the truth. And each time one of them was dismissed or reassigned, Elizabeth would sit a little longer by the fire that night, tracing patterns in the ash, wondering if love was always so temporary, if attachment always led to loss, and if the only safe way to be held was to never ask for arms at all. And yet, through it all, the memory of Anne refused to leave. No one spoke of her. No portraits hung. No prayers mentioned her name. But Elizabeth felt her, in dreams that came without warning, dreams in which a dark-haired woman with a crown of pearls turned to speak and vanished before words could be heard. In the curve of her own hands when placed against a mirror, in the way courtiers glanced at her sideways and then looked away, as if guilty for having seen what they were told no longer existed. In the letters she was not allowed to read but saw sealed with red wax and tucked hurriedly away when she entered the room. Anne was not gone. She was buried in the walls. She was stitched into every silence, folded into the hesitation before a compliment, pressed like a ghost between the lines of scripture and scandal. And when Elizabeth began to read more books in Latin and French, histories of queens and martyrs, scrolls of law and prophecy, she began to understand the shape of what had been taken from her. Not just a mother, but a legacy, a name, a space that should have been hers to stand in without apology. She read the story of Esther and underlined the verses in which a woman risked her life for her people. She studied Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, Boudica, and found, in each, pieces of herself. But it was her mother's story never told aloud, never printed in her tutor's books that lingered most in her blood. She collected fragments where she could, a phrase from a visiting cousin, a note tucked into the spine of a borrowed manuscript, a whisper carried from a sympathetic maid who had once served in the Queen's apartments. From these crumbs, she built an image, not just of Anne, but of a woman who had spoken her mind in a world that punished female voices, who had loved dangerously, ruled briefly, fallen swiftly, and died with dignity that no executioner's blade could erase. And so, Elizabeth kept that image in the quiet spaces between lessons and prayers, between dawn and dusk. Like a secret fire, she dared not show anyone. And though the women who raised her tried to steer her toward safe paths, toward silence, toward humility, the memory of Anne Boleyn refused to fade because it had never been truly extinguished. It had only been planted, and it was growing. Each time she looked in the mirror and saw the arch of her brows, the tilt of her chin, each time someone addressed her with cool formality, as if fearing what she might become, each time she was reminded of what she was not supposed to remember. Anne had been erased from court, but she had not been erased from Elizabeth. And in the spaces between the women who mothered her, the girl who would one day be queen learned this, that a mother's absence can become a daughter's power, that silence can become memory, and that memory, when held carefully, when guarded fiercely, can become something stronger than law, louder than trumpet, and more enduring than the sharpest sword. There is a particular kind of sorrow in watching a child outgrow a dress, not because it is no longer fashionable, but because it was never meant to last. A sorrow stitched into every fraying hem, and every desperate seam let down one more time than it should have been. And Elizabeth knew this sorrow well, not because she wept over gowns that clung too tight or sleeves that rode too short, but because every piece of clothing she wore was a reminder that she had been measured once and left behind. as if the court had determined how far she might grow and prepared no further. The women who dressed her in those early years did so with patience and threadbare care, turning garments inside out, reusing bits of old ribbon, cutting old linens into fresh collars, while waiting for coin that never arrived. And each day that Elizabeth stood before the glass and lifted her arms, she learned a lesson sharper than grammar or psalm, that the world would not make room for her, that she would not be given what she needed in the right time or size, and that if she were to fit into anything, it would be by force of will, not permission. There came a moment quiet, almost invisible, when she no longer asked if new gowns were coming, and no longer looked at other girls' silks with longing, no longer mentioned the shoes that pinched, or the cloak that no longer reached her knees. Instead, she learned to move within the fabric as if it belonged to her anyway, to wear discomfort like armor, to make the court believe that she was choosing simplicity, even as it was choosing to ignore her. And in this quiet endurance, the foundations of something greater were being laid, something regal, something unbending, something that did not rustle with the satin of approval, but stood still in the absence of it. The court did not see it. They saw a girl in old clothes. They saw a name removed from succession. They saw a child growing too tall for her station. But they did not see the way she watched them all, the way she remembered every phrase, every face, every slight. They did not notice how she held her spine straight even when her shoes hurt, how she spoke softly, but with words no one corrected, how she asked questions that seemed innocent but held the shape of strategy. What the court could not see was that she was not trying to fit into their world. She was building a new one in silence, measured not by inheritance, but by intellect, not by marriage, but by memory, and far from the throne room, far from the noise and perfume and pageantry. Something waited, not a gift, not a reward, not a handout, but a crown, heavy and tarnished by the blood of those who had worn it before. A crown that did not call her name yet, but had begun to turn slightly in her direction, as if aware, as if curious, as if considering. It was not destiny that waited. It was possibility, and possibility is the cruelest crown of all, for it demands patience without promise. Elizabeth did not know when or how she would claim her place, or if she ever would, but she knew she would be ready if it came. She read not only histories, but laws. She recited not only psalms, but diplomatic letters. She practiced not only music, but the art of silence, of saying just enough, of speaking last, of holding gaze without fear. And though the dresses no longer fit, her mind grew endlessly. She studied her brother's tutors when they visited. She listened through doors when ambassadors passed. She observed the shifting alliances of court with eyes that did not blink. And when a new queen came, Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, the one with a calm voice and a scholar's patience, Elizabeth observed her with guarded curiosity, unsure whether to reach or retreat. But Catherine saw something in Elizabeth that others had missed or had chosen to ignore, a sharpness cloaked in gentleness, a mind lit not with girlish fantasy, but with purpose, a hunger that could not be satisfied with embroidery hoops and quiet walks. And so Catherine, unlike the women before her, gave Elizabeth more than pity. She gave her books, philosophy, theology, Greek, and permission not spoken, but felt to become something more than what the court had decided. And in that space, Elizabeth began to blossom, not loudly, not with flourish, but with quiet precision, like ink slowly spreading across parchment, reaching corners thought to be blank, filling in spaces that others had left empty. She wore her 2 small dresses without complaint. She walked behind her brother, behind her father, behind the procession of women whose power came and went like seasons, but in her eyes was something permanent, something waiting, something neither crown nor council could undo. The girl who once asked why her title had vanished was no longer asking questions. She was preparing answers. And though no one yet saw the shape of what she would become, though no proclamation was carved, though no music played for her, there was a crown waiting quietly, not because it had been promised, but because it had been earned day by day, word by word, silence by silence. And when at last the time would come, when the world turned again and needed a queen, she would not need to try on robes to see if they fit, for she had grown beyond what they could measure. There are women who carry ghosts in their mirrors, not behind them, but within the kind of ghosts that speak not in whispers, but in instincts, in sullen silences, in the way a heart closes its doors before a voice ever reaches the threshold. And Elizabeth, daughter of the beheaded queen, grew into such a woman, one who learned not from caution but from blood, not from warning but from memory. And as she came of age in a court that measured a woman's worth in her ability to marry, to bear heirs, to surrender gracefully, she began to understand that she would never be safe in the arms of any man, not because she lacked beauty or charm or intelligence, but because she knew too clearly what those arms had done to the last woman who wore her crown. She did not say it aloud, not to her tutors, not to her guardians, not even to herself, but the decision was already forming, like frost on glass. Invisible in daylight, but unmistakable by dawn. She would never marry, not because she could not love, but because she had seen what love looked like when it was placed in a man's hands with the weight of a crown behind it, and how quickly it turned from warmth to weapon, how easily a vow could become a verdict, how swiftly a kiss could lead to a sword. She had watched the fate of women in her father's shadow. Catherine discarded, Anne beheaded, Jane dead in childbirth, Anne of Cleves cast aside, Catherine Howard destroyed, and Catherine Parr, surviving only because she stepped carefully across the minefield of Henry's moods, with the quiet discipline of a scholar who knew that any wrong word could turn a husband into an executioner. Elizabeth took notes. She observed. She remembered. And somewhere between childhood and coronation, she became a woman made of tempered glass, transparent, but unbreakable, reflecting everything, revealing nothing. When offers of marriage came, and they came often from princes of France and dukes of Austria, from Spain, from Sweden, from noble houses that promised peace, if only she would tie herself to their line, she listened, smiled, nodded with practiced grace, and then set the proposals aside like discarded gowns too heavy for her shoulders. It wasn't that she did not believe in union. It was that she understood its cost. And the ghost of Anne Boleyn stood always near, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in books, sometimes in the tilt of a harp string or the rustle of velvet in a hallway, watching, never speaking, but always reminding, Anne, who had risen too quickly and fallen too sharply. Anne, whose voice had once echoed in the king's chamber, and whose body had then lain broken in a box not meant for royalty. Anne, whose daughter now stood taller than the men who once dismissed her, who ruled with a pen steadier than any sword. And still, Elizabeth did not speak of her mother. She wore no pendant with Anne's face. She built no monument. She allowed no chapel to sing her name. But every time she stepped onto the council floor and held a room in silence, Every time she refused a marriage treaty dressed as diplomacy. Every time she signed her name not as wife or mother, but as sovereign. She was speaking for the woman who had died to give her that right. They called her the Virgin Queen. They said she had no husband. But she had one. England. And that was enough. She belonged to her people. Not to a man. Not to a dynasty. Not to the desires of foreign courts who saw her as a chess piece to be moved across maps stained with ambition. She ruled alone. But she was never truly alone. In the hallways of Whitehall. In the gardens of Richmond. In the shadows cast by the golden canopy of Westminster Abbey. The ghost of Anne Boleyn followed her, not as a curse, but as a compass, and perhaps that was why, when Elizabeth stood before the mirror on the morning of her coronation in the year 1559, dressed in gold, the air thick with frankincense, the sky above London shivering with bells, she did not tremble. She did not pray for a husband. She did not bow to expectation. She stood still, and if anyone had asked her what she saw, reflected back beyond the crown, beyond the ermine, beyond the weight of history, perhaps she would have said, I see her. The woman who was not allowed to live. The woman who was never allowed to be a queen. And now, through me, she is both. There comes a moment, near the end, when a woman can sit alone in a quiet room, surrounded not by advisors or ambassadors, or the whispers of courtiers, but only by candlelight, by the ticking of a distant clock, and by the slow rhythm of her own breath, and in that silence, without ceremony or witness. And she can finally ask herself the question that no one else dared ask aloud. Was it worth it? And for Elizabeth, Queen of England, ruler of a realm that had once tried to forget her, the answer came not in words but in the stillness of her body, in the way her hands rested open on her lap, in the flicker of her eyes as they stared into the fire, and in the presence quiet, invisible, but certain of the child she had once been, sitting beside her in the shadows, watching. The girl who had outgrown dresses that never fit. The girl who had been called lady when she once was princess. The girl who had not cried when her mother vanished, but had learned instead to wait. That girl still lived within her, not as weakness, not as a scar, but as a foundation, built of memory, of absence, of every unanswered question that had shaped the way Elizabeth held herself before kings, before parliaments, before the judgment of history. She had lived her life in rooms that remembered blood, walked corridors where her mother had begged, had died, had been buried in haste and shame. And yet Elizabeth had walked those same floors with her head high, not to defy the past, but to reclaim it. She had rewritten the story not by erasing its beginning, but by changing its ending. They had written her off as a bastard. She had signed her name in royal ink. They had said she would be a pawn. She had ruled for over 4 decades. They had warned that without a husband, she would fall. She had stood longer than any king of her age. Now, at the edge of sleep, in the final pages of her life, she thought not of victory or of empire, but of the girl who had once asked, "Why am I no longer princess?" and of the mother who had not been allowed to answer. There was no portrait of Anne Boleyn in her chamber, no inscription carved in marble. But Elizabeth did not need them. She had carried her mother not in frame or stone but in the choices she had made, in the silences she had endured, in the laws she had signed, and in the prayers she had whispered in Latin at dawn. Always alone, always standing. She had loved England, not as a wife loves a husband, but as a daughter loves a home that once turned her away and which she rebuilt, brick by careful brick. until it could no longer deny her name. Now the fire crackled lower. The candles softened into gold, and she allowed her eyelids to drift downward. Not in fear. Not in regret. But in rest. The sword that had fallen had not ended her story. It had begun it. And in the quiet of that final hour, there was no need for crowns or robes or trumpets. Only stillness. And in that stillness, two shadows leaned together, the girl and the queen. The child who had lost her mother and the woman who had found herself, and in their silence, England slept.